Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted and only a little alarmed to have the privilege of delivering the Kilbrandon lecture this evening. My theme tonight is leadership, particularly focused on child protection. Over the years, like many of you in this hall, I have had to complete questionnaires about personality traits and decision-making preferences, which are then converted into leadership styles. There was the KAI score on the adaptive innovative continuum, the Myers-Briggs scales, and various colour-related tests, to mention the ones I can remember, all derived from psychometric testing and interpretation, whose validity has subsequently been called into question. The body of knowledge and theory about leadership is mostly dull and dry as dust, and so unlike the many colourful leaders we are familiar with. So tonight I fall back on what I know and what I've learned over 4 decades in social work. For a start, there is a wide agreement that vision is important, setting out a clear path to what needs to be done, inspiring confidence that you know what you're doing and why, and in social work, of course, doing it because you have the right values and are true to them. And here I will begin by quoting 4 lines from a great Scottish orator from quite a different sector, who conveyed this in a few simple sentences. Jimmy Reid showed the most extraordinary leadership right here in Glasgow when he was the centre of worldwide attention. In 1971, in a famous speech given to the workers of Upper Clyde shipbuilders, Jimmy Reid announced the beginning of workers' control of the shipyard and insisted on self-discipline while this took place. He said, and many of you will know this, "We are not going to strike. We are not even having a sit-in strike. Nobody and nothing will come in and nothing will go out without our permission. And there will be no hooliganism. There will be no vandalism. There will be no bevying, because the world is watching us and it's our responsibility to conduct ourselves with responsibility and with dignity and with maturity." Now, there was a leader who knew his followers only too well in their strengths and their frailties. He conveyed his vision with stunning clarity and a touch of humour, and was supported by thousands of workers because they thought he was right. And of course, in his case, he could only lead with their agreement. This historic event ultimately led to the Heath government changing its mind and investing in the yards in the following year. But to return to leadership and research on leadership, it has historically been conducted through the private sector, but over time, more attention has been paid to public services, and even in some countries, to child welfare and child protection organisations. The evidence, consistent with what we know from scrutiny and inspection in Scotland, is that the quality of leadership has a great impact on the work environment, the staff, and most importantly, the outcomes for vulnerable children. In a range of investigative roles, it has been my job to identify why terrible things happen to children and young people, and in some instances to adults, and what could have protected them from abuse. Earlier this year, I had the pleasure of meeting Frank Cottrell-Boyce, my predecessor in this role. He was clearly well acquainted with my report on Rotherham, and we had a good chat about it. He's a wonderful, fascinating speaker, concealing sharp messages within his beguiling way with words. And as time has gone on, I've become a little anxious about what possible connections there might be between his themes and mine tonight. But nothing concentrates the mind like a looming deadline, especially if you're sitting on a cold platform on Warrington Bank Quay station, as I was last night, waiting for a delayed train to Glasgow, wondering how on earth I was going to open and close this important lecture. I reread Frank's speech, and even his title struck me as connected. It was "Tell a Different Story." That, I hope, is what I did in Rotherham and on other occasions in my career. And that is where I want to start, with some possible interpretations of why, in some instances, leadership fails and in some instances, why it succeeds. I will go on to talk about a different model of leadership from the adult services field and from the Netherlands. And later I have some observations about professional and other forms of leadership in social work services in Scotland. So let me tell you a story and take you back to 2001 in Rotherham. And I'm going to a young researcher who was seconded from her law practice was participating in Home Office-funded research on child sexual exploitation, part of a UK-wide study. One afternoon, she accompanied a young girl, whom I shall call Susie, to a police office where she was to visit the following day in order to make a formal complaint about sexual abuse. The researcher was taking her there to familiarise her with the place and the officer who would be conducting the interview. The girl had been repeatedly raped and had tried to escape her perpetrators, but was terrified of reprisals. They'd put all the windows in at her family home and broken both of her brother's legs, in quotes, to send a message. At that point, she agreed to make a complaint to the police. Whilst at the office with the researcher, she received texts and voicemails from the main perpetrator. He had with him her 11-year-old sister. He texted repeatedly, "Your choice, your choice." The girl did not proceed with her complaint and is quoted by the researcher as saying, "You can't protect me." Apart from raising questions about how the perpetrator knew where the girl was and what she intended to do, this case became the final straw for the researcher. And according to her account, she discussed this with her manager and the research project steering committee, and it was agreed she would write to the chief constable and the district commander of police for the borough. Her letter was approved by her line manager. I have read this letter, and it politely but firmly states that this problem had been going on in the borough of Rotherham for years and wasn't it time that the police did something about it and took the issue seriously. She asked what the police intended to do about these children and young people who were being repeatedly raped and beaten up. She received no reply from the chief constable, and it was interesting to me to see him being interviewed by the Home Affairs Select Committee of the Westminster Parliament, being asked exactly these questions many, many years later, 17 years later, actually. However, she was called into a meeting with the district commander and some senior council officials from Education and Social Services, and instructed never to do such a thing again. In other words, to write to the chief constable, or indeed to the district commander. The content of her letter was not discussed. Later, towards the end of the research project, the researcher had to submit her data and a draft chapter to the authorities concerned in Rotherham. It contained serious criticisms of alleged indifference towards and ignorance of the issue of child sexual exploitation on the part of senior managers in the police and the council. Responsibility was continuously placed on young people's shoulders rather than with the suspected abusers. The senior officers in the police and the council were deeply unhappy about this. There was a suggestion that facts had been fabricated or exaggerated, and several sources reported that the researcher was subject to personalised hostility at the hand of officials. She was suspended from work by the council on the basis that she had committed an act of gross misconduct by including in the data minutes of confidential interagency meetings. After a formal meeting, and bearing in mind this researcher was a lawyer, she was reinstated when she was able to show that the relevant minutes had in fact been handed to the Home Office research evaluators by her manager. As part of the settlement, the council gave her a positive reference and paid for counselling, and this issue damaged this young woman's life and career for some considerable time. I'm glad to say she is fully recovered now. But she spent the remainder of her contract in a room on her own, working on policies and procedures, forbidden access to the girls involved, and not allowed to attend meetings or have access to further data. 12 years later, in my inquiry, we read most of the case files on which the alleged fabricated profiles had been based and found them to be accurate accounts, entirely consistent with our own reading of what had happened to the girls involved. And what happened to Susie? Susie had been groomed by an older man involved in the exploitation of other children. She loved this man and believed he loved her. He trafficked her to Leeds, Bradford, and Sheffield, and offered to provide her with a flat in one of those cities. A child protection referral was made, but the social care case file recorded no response to this. Within months, Susie and her family were living in fear of their lives, as described earlier. She was assaulted by other victims at the instigation of the perpetrator. Her brother was attacked, and Susie herself also required hospital treatment for severe internal bruising. A younger child in the family had to go into hiding so that the perpetrators could not carry out threats against her. Susie had been stalked, and she had had petrol poured over her, and she was threatened with being set alight. She took overdoses. She and her family were too terrified to make statements to the police, and in any case had no confidence in them. By the time she was 18, her family situation had broken down and she was homeless. She referred herself to social care and was given advice about benefits. No further action was taken. Susie and her family were completely failed by all of the statutory services. All of this information was taken from records and could have been replicated hundreds of times with accounts of other children in similar circumstances, and of course could have been read by anybody inside the organisation in a senior position who took the trouble to do so. Now, I tell this story not to focus on the appalling abuse involved, but to illustrate how the decisions leaders make at critical points can directly impact on the lives of vulnerable children. This particular episode, and another concerning two different research reports, was only ever about senior people across services and their responses to unpalatable information. It was not about frontline staff or their lack of training or lack of communication or any other issues that we read so much about in any kind of review of any child protection cases. These leaders were more concerned about their own reputations and that of their agencies than what the reports themselves were telling them. And it was their choice as leaders whether or not to do the right thing. But to turn to a more positive example of leadership in Rotherham, in 2006, a new district commander of police was appointed to the borough. On arrival, he received a letter from the project manager of the youth project called Risky Business, which was the only source of support to exploited girls for years. I should say that this project was almost a case study in itself. It operated on an outreach basis with large numbers of victims and simply never gave up on the girls. But although part of the council, there was statutory help that these girls needed that only the statutory services could provide. And there was a great deal of friction with social services over their reluctance to allocate cases. They did not see it as a priority. The project staff were all too often seen as something of a nuisance, on occasion breaking rules and getting into trouble for not doing things in the orthodox way. But the project manager was persistent, dogged, and wrote to the new district commander asking him what he was going to do about CSE in the borough, which had continued much as it had been 5 years earlier when the researcher asked the same question. She expected nothing, but to her surprise, the new district commander, whom I've met incidentally and interviewed for the purpose of the report, the new district commander visited the project on several occasions, learned about grooming, designated specific officers to work on the issue full-time, and even arranged for her staff to be trained in intelligence gathering, recognising the value of the mass of soft information they held. One staff member was even given the status of an official police informer to allow an easier transfer of valuable material. Unfortunately, she used to go into meetings and tell everybody, so it was kind of defeated the purpose of the status. Whilst this district commander was in post, was the most positive and effective period of joint working and attempts to catch the criminals involved, which culminated in a successful police operation, Operation Central, in 2008. This led to the conviction of 5 men. It was used as a model of excellent joint working practice for years. And I give this example to show how powerful a different leadership approach could be. Here was someone who was more interested in the issues than in the status of the person raising these issues with him. For most of this time, policing priorities had been burglary and car crime, which were deemed to be more important than the rape and abuse of children. But of course, they did not recognise these young girls as children, despite the fact that they absolutely and legally were. But in the police terminology about them, they were regarded as slags, tarts and scrubbers, in quotes. And these were very much taken, this was confirmed by a great many people in the course of my work. I also wanted to give another example of courageous leadership from the unlikely source of the chief executive who commissioned my report. He was not employed by the council during the worst years of the neglect of CSE. Despite considerable resistance from his political leadership, he pressed for a full, independent report on what had happened over 16 years, including the killer question, who knew what, when, and what did they do about it? He reaped a whirlwind and resigned following the publication of my report, but he did the right thing at the time with the right motivation, and trying to make sure that everything was brought out into the open for the sake of victims and survivors. There are a handful of questions which I'm always asked about Rotherham from interviewers across the world. One of these is, why did it happen? How could so many people do nothing? And there are 2 particular theoretical approaches that strike me as having some relevance to this question and to the theme of leadership. The first is groupthink, a term I'm sure people are very familiar with here, which was coined by the social psychologist Irving Janis in 1972. It occurs when a group makes faulty decisions because group pressures lead to a deterioration of mental efficiency, reality testing, and moral judgment. I think we can safely say those were all present in Rotherham. Groups affected by groupthink ignore alternatives and tend to take irrational actions that dehumanize other groups. A group is especially vulnerable to groupthink when its members are similar in background, when the group is insulated from outside opinions, and where there are no clear rules for decision-making. Janis describes symptoms of groupthink, an illusion of invulnerability, which creates excessive optimism that encourages taking of extreme risks, collective rationalization, belief in inherent morality, stereotype views of outgroups or opposition, direct pressure on dissenters, self-censorship, doubts and deviations from the perceived group consensus are not tolerated, an illusion of unanimity, and self-appointed mind guards who protect the leader from any problematic or contradictory information. And we'll come back to that in relation to the other approach that I would like to mention. Both the definition and the symptoms have much resonance for me in Rotherham, not just as illustrated in the story of the researcher, but in many other ways sustained by senior officers and elected members over 16 years. In relation to political leadership, for example, where there was single-party dominance for decades, with non-existent opposition, of 63 members, 59 were from the same party. There was a very weak council scrutiny mechanism, coupled with senior officers who did not formally report the scale and seriousness of the issues to elected members over several years, even though they had been informed of it by other sources. The second theoretical area which I think is relevant is that of willful blindness. This is a term used in criminal law to refer to the acts of a person who intentionally fails to be informed about matters that would make the person criminally liable. Latterly, the Canadian academic Margaret Heffernan has applied the concept to the actions or inactions apparent in a range of global problems, and indeed has interviewed me at length about Rotherham, which she believes to be another example of willful blindness in an organisation. She first encountered it in the Enron scandal. In quotes, "If there is knowledge that you could have had and should have had, but chose not to have," summarises it. In another analysis of General Motors, she observed that everybody had a responsibility to fix a particular problem, but nobody took responsibility to do it. And indeed, I used the phrase myself when I was describing the safeguarding board in the Rotherham area, where there was lots of policies and procedures that were very good, but in effect, the issue that appeared to belong to everybody effectively belonged to nobody. There were too many people from the same background sharing the same beliefs and blind spots. And regarding Rotherham, her conclusion was that in the early years, nobody had the clarity, energy, or the will to speak up, except for the researcher. And of course, she was punished for it. There are some pertinent remedies suggested to counteract these behaviours for those in leadership roles, and I'm sure that many of us here have had to deploy them on occasions. So when important decisions have to be made, the leader should encourage every member of their team to be a critical evaluator and should avoid stating their own preferences and expectations at the outset. One or more experts should be invited to meetings and encouraged to challenge the views of members. And someone in the team who is articulate and knowledgeable should be given the role of devil's advocate to question assumptions and plans. In leadership terms, I've always been a strong advocate of senior people modelling the kind of behaviour they wish to promote in their workforce. And this was an important part of my work as Chief Social Work Inspector on leadership in the inspection of social work in Scotland and in local authorities in a variety of investigations, and also, of course, in Rotherham. This area is, of course, related to organisational culture and who sets the tone. It is a powerful force that guides decisions and actions, and those who hold senior positions, including corporate leaders and politicians, play a large part in defining organisational culture by what they say and do. This includes values, attitudes, beliefs, and even working language. This becomes even more critical when discussing such a highly sensitive and highly charged social problem as child sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation. I had something to say in my report about the organisational culture in Rotherham, both in the council and the police. A succession of senior officers, male and female, told me about the sexist, bullying and machismo climate in which they worked. And that was until relatively recently. Much of it was unrepeatable here in this refined company, but suffice to say that one ex-member of senior staff described it as a very grubby environment in which to work. In itself, it was a cause of great concern for the staff affected and how it made them feel. But it was also important because of the messages these senior people conveyed about their attitudes to women and presumably about girls, and presumably about girls who were involved in underage sexual activity. And on occasions, the license it would appear to provide to others throughout the organisation to do exactly the same. In other words, if the leader does it, then everyone else feels free to copy that unless they stand firmly on their principles. All of this kind of cultural influence on how people perceive problems and rationalise doing nothing about them was very well summed up in a different context in 2013 by the then Director of Public Prosecution, Keir Starmer, who set out an agreed approach which prosecutors would take to tackle cases of child sexual abuse. He nailed down a list of stereotypical behaviours previously thought to undermine the credibility of young victims when bringing a prosecution. These included: the victim invited sex by the way they dressed or acted. The victim used alcohol or drugs and was therefore sexually available. The victim didn't scream, fight, or protest, so they must have been consenting. The victim didn't complain immediately, so it can't have been a sexual assault. The victim is in a relationship with the alleged offender and is therefore a willing partner. A victim should remember events consistently. Children can consent to their own sexual exploitation. Child sexual exploitation is only a problem in certain ethnic and cultural communities. And only girls and young women are victims of child sexual abuse. Children from minority ethnic backgrounds are not abused. And finally, there will be physical evidence of abuse. And actually, I would add to this list another stereotype, that children with learning disabilities cannot make reliable witnesses. And as many of you here will know, they are in themselves a particular category who are targeted for abuse. All of the above elements have been referred to at some point in records we read, not just historic and not just in Rotherham. Usually comments made by the police or the CP at the Crown Prosecution Service, or indeed the Crown Office in Scotland, for not pursuing suspected perpetrators. Similar sentiments were also reflected in other agencies as part of the justification for their inertia when faced with these crimes. And on many occasions in Rotherham, we believed but could not prove that these attitudes were led from the top. And I want to turn to another form of leadership, something quite different, both operationally and professionally, which I recently got to know about. It's an example from the Netherlands in the field of adult services, as some of you may already be familiar with it. It was created and implemented by a man called Jos de Blok, who runs a not-for-profit nursing and care service. For many years, Jos, a nurse, worked in senior positions for a range of employers in the healthcare sector and found himself frustrated by his experiences, both as a manager and as a professional, and on behalf of those receiving support. In a nutshell, he saw fragmentation of prevention, treatment, and support, multiple caregivers for one person, big capacity problems, low quality, high costs, and the wrong incentives to improve. So he decided to start his own organisation with its own care delivery model and began in 2007 with one team of 4 nurses. By 2013, he employed 6,500 nurses in 630 teams across the Netherlands. But here's the trick: no hierarchy. There is a minimal back office of 35 people. There are 15 professional coaches and no managers. They deal with mostly older people with multiple pathologies, dementia, end-of-life care, and what we used to call convalescence, now early supported discharge from hospital. As to the results, in independent testing, they came highest in the Netherlands for patient satisfaction of over 300 similar organisations. Their overhead costs, because they have so little infrastructure, is 8% compared to their country average for similar organisations of 25%. Their sickness rate is less than half the average, at 3%, and its profit rate is 8%, though this is reinvested in services as a not-for-profit organisation. The Netherlands government now uses Jos de Blok as an advisor, and all political parties exhort others to work like Buurtzorg. So how has this been achieved? Well, his model is self-organisation within community networks, a strong sense of shared values, optimal autonomy and no hierarchy. Reduction of complexity. Jos is very keen on keeping everything simple. He placed the highest importance on his IT system, which all the staff use, and was designed along with them. The teams organise their own work according to the changing needs of their patients. When I visited Jos in the Netherlands earlier this year and began to understand his model, I asked, knowing quite well what the answer would be, do you do performance appraisal? A vigorous no was the response. A waste of time. The teams share feedback on each other's work and can invite coaches in to assist if they can't deal with performance issues themselves. And of course, there is a clear system if anything such as fraud occurs, which it rarely does. Their quality system monitors outcomes instead of production, roles and activities instead of processes. There is a strong emphasis on education, with each team having their own budget for this, and now they have created their own academy with an accredited degree. I don't present the Buurtzorg, that's the name of the organisation, the Buurtzorg model to you as a template for leaders in our field or as a model to be followed in child protection, but rather as an alternative and interesting way of delivering professional leadership based on the absolute trust of the Chief Executive in the professional maturity and skills of his staff. It is probably not unique, but there are few similar models on such a scale in the care sector that I'm aware of. To achieve this in over 600 teams across the country is no mean feat, and they use the networks very productively to share good practice and learn from others. Interestingly, Jos de Blok was looking to expand the model into working with vulnerable young people and even in the youth justice field, with the appropriate professionals involved, of course. So it will certainly be worth tracking how that works. And now for the final part of this lecture, I want to turn to Scotland with some thoughts about leadership and child protection here. I suppose the question is, our child protection system now, is it still fit for purpose? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that the emerging challenges of female genital mutilation, online grooming, child sexual exploitation cannot simply be shoehorned into our current systems without some impact. Attitudes to these new areas need to change. Current systems were designed for a different purpose, essentially for addressing abuse, and particularly sexual abuse, within the home. So I do get impatient when I hear people say, what's the fuss about child sexual exploitation, and why is it necessary to deal with anything any differently than we currently do in the child protection system? We all know how to deal with abuse. Actually, it is different, and there are entirely different areas of knowledge that people need to understand in order to address the issues, and they will never do so until there is that recognition. It does not fit the domestic model of abuse in a person's own home. Regarding the structure for child protection coordination, I am aware of changes being considered in other parts of the UK. I'm currently reviewing the Safeguarding Board of Northern Ireland, which has replaced several local and one regional child protection committee with a single Northern Ireland board. This was around 3 years ago, and of course local panels. Wales has legislated to put in place an All Wales board, and in England there is much discussion about whether the existing local safeguarding boards are working effectively or not. And I understand that the same debate is taking place in Scotland. In reality, there are issues about the independence of the body concerned, and from my experience, too much time is wasted on process and focus on certain aspects of governance, as opposed to the focus on what the real work of these bodies should be. Of course, the independent chair is important, but beyond that, the idea of all of these bodies of being wholly independent is simply a myth, because you must always have the right people round the table in order for the best decisions to be made. I do support an independent chair, as I've seen them operating, and it's been extremely helpful. But I'm afraid it has been my experience of a great deal of discussion, too much, about the composition of boards and the way in which, certainly in other parts of the UK, people have tried to artificially create a degree of independence that simply is not possible to put in place, and have the expertise and knowledge of the operational systems that you need. Inevitably, of course, all of this has implications for the role of the chair as leader. Across all countries in the UK, there are at least issues about the focus of activity and numbers, and questions, are they too strategic or not strategic enough? One Ellis local safeguarding board, Birmingham actually, in England, has 60 members. Some chairs are of the view that size of membership doesn't matter, that skilled chairing and structure are more important. In Scotland, we've retained the remit specifically for child protection, though in reality widening interest to include well-being. Some interesting paradoxes and unintended consequences have emerged from the experience of the safeguarding approach in England and in Northern Ireland. Safeguarding conceptually is well embedded in the respectable Western European model of improvement and well-being, inevitably improving protection of the small number of children who need this. But some chairs in England have told me that it has meant, in reality, a focus on the easy problems, on areas such as training, at the expense of the hard-edged interagency issues such as risk, quality assurance, outcomes, and holding other agencies to account for where their practice is weak. The important function of dissemination of learning can also be rendered almost useless if the review reports of individual serious incidents take many months, and in some cases, some parts of the UK, years to be produced. A couple of other points I would care to make here, if you will indulge me. One is about the support to professional leadership offered by the universities over decades. With some honourable exceptions, of which I of course include Strathclyde, I have been disappointed that so little leading-edge research and thinking about social work has been provided by the social work training courses over the course of my career. I'm aware that this might only have been the case in the first 25 years or so, but when I first started to talk on equal terms with health partners in the early 90s, there was so little that I could point to as to what we now call evidence-based practice, and that was too late. I was embarrassed that in the fields of health and education, practitioners and managers expected and received a lead from academics in these areas. In social work, we did not, and it's only recently that the profession has begun to recover from that. Another area of concern for me is one in which I must declare my interest as a former Chief Inspector of Social Work. My view of regulation and inspection is that the responsible body must support the development of the profession and not just scrutinise it. We need more leaders across relevant public bodies to be recognised leaders of the social work profession. The Scottish Government's commitment to the Chief Social Work Advisor post was an important stage in this, and many of us were grateful for this acknowledgement. Equally important was the Scottish Government's continued affirmation of the role of the Chief Social Work Officer in the integration process. These are the visible signs of recognition of the distinctive contribution that social work can make to civil society, and that we are equal partners with education and health, and not the poor relation. I also want to acknowledge one important example of corporate leadership of social work in the past year that has a bearing on child protection, and that is from the City of Edinburgh Council. 2 of its social workers were found guilty of contempt of court for changing contact arrangements for children previously set by a sheriff. The City Council was excluded as a party from their hearing. The Council stood by its 2 staff and arranged to appeal the convictions. 3 senior judges in the Court of Session fully exonerated the social worker, quashed the contempt of court order imposed by the sheriff concerned, and cast doubt on the legality of the handling of the case by her. There was, of course, a cost to the workers in human terms of a prolonged ordeal which threatened their professional reputations and livelihoods. But it was an appeal that needed to be won if social workers were to continue to act in good faith in the best interests of children, especially when faced with rapidly changing circumstances and without fear of falling foul of the law. In Scotland, we have many positive features going forward. Getting it right for every child is one of these features. The every is important because it captures a universal aspiration to make Scotland a better place to grow up in for all children, while at the same time emphasising that we need to do more for the most vulnerable, marginalised and neglected children in our country. We have strong legislation and policy on child welfare here, though there may be issues about implementation. In Celsius, we know that addressing processes alone will not achieve the improvements and outcomes we need. And to close the implementation gap, we need to be informed about what makes sustained change happen. However, I should say that a couple of weeks ago, the Children's Commissioner for Northern Ireland was extolling the virtues of the Scottish system to me and wishing that they could export all their vulnerable children to Scotland so they would get far better, where they would get far better care and protection. So finally, and it is finally, I'm nearing the end of this lecture and my stories. And to close, I was thinking what I would say to a hall full of newly graduated social workers about how they should be, in my opinion, as leaders of tomorrow. And of course, on last Friday, I did face a hall full of new graduates, and very impressive they were here from 36 countries. But they were from the business school, so a little different. But I'm going to imagine that you're all newly qualified social workers, all desperately keen to go out into the world and do well. I think I would tell them, well, I think I would not tell them about strategic planning and performance management and a load of stuff like that. I am sure that excellent employers will send them onto MBA courses and during their careers where they will learn a great deal about that. But I would tell them to remember that public service in its widest sense, and social work in particular, is precious, and we lose sight of their values at our peril. So I would say don't be defensive or bureaucratic or patronising to anybody. Be bold in challenging injustice and poor practice. Listen carefully. Don't be complacent about how good you think either you are or your services are. As I said on Friday, and I would repeat it now, to any young person starting out in this field, the script of your working life is yours to write. Everything is possible and nothing is guaranteed. But whatever you do, in due course, as a leader, do it with humanity. Thank you very much.
Support.